Hello and welcome to my YouTube. This YouTube is Remembering the Year 1865. Hi, I'm your host. I'm Robert Reese. Back in 2009, I was awarded a doctorate degree in public service. And so, in keeping with the spirit of that degree to help my fellow man, I have been putting up a series of over 32 YouTubes remembering the years where I relived the history of what was going on in America and in the world during that year. This is one of those YouTubes, but this time, rather than choosing a year in which I lived, I'm going back to one of the most important years in American history, 1865, the end of the Civil War. And so I hope you enjoyed this YouTube, and more importantly, I hope you learned something new that you didn't know about the history of this great country. The Civil War had been raging for 4 years, and nearly 600,000 soldiers had already died in the war. On January 4th, the New York Stock Exchange opens its first permanent headquarters at 10 Broad near Wall Street in New York City. On January 31st, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which prohibited slavery, passed narrowly in the House of Representatives. On January 13th, Confederate General Robert E. Lee becomes General-in-Chief. You know, a lot of us, when we think of General Robert E. Lee, we think of this great general leading the Confederate forces all across America during the duration of the Civil War. And that simply wasn't true. He was appointed Commander-in-Chief on January 13th, and he surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse less than 90 days later. So he was the Commander-in-Chief for only about 3 months. On February 3rd, at Hampton Roads, there was a conference between Union and Confederate leaders to discuss peace terms. By this time, it was already clear to the Confederates that they were going to lose the war. On March 6th, President Lincoln's second inaugural ball. He had been reelected in 1964. On March 12th, Ham's Brewery opens in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I remember their commercials from the land of sky blue water. Over the years, they were bought by various brewers, Pabst, Miller's, Coors. On March 13th, the Confederate States of America agree to the use of African American troops. By this late in the war, the Confederate States were simply running out of eligible white men to fight, and so they decided to use black men, slaves. On March 18th, the Congress of the Confederate States of America adjourns for the very last time. So the Confederacy is almost all but gone by now. On April 1st, the Battle of Five Forks in Petersburg, Virginia, Confederate General Robert E. Lee begins his final offensive. So note the date, April 1st. On April 2nd, Confederate President Jefferson Davis and most of his cabinet flee the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, which is taken by Union troops the next day. On April 9th, General Robert E. Lee surrenders to Union Army General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, and this effectively ends the Civil War. But as you'll see over the next few slides, that was not the end of fighting, and General Lee did not surrender all of the Confederate forces, as you will see. "5 days later, after the signing of surrender of Appomattox, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. He is shot while attending an evening performance of the comedy Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., by a very famous and very well-known actor, John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes had drilled a little hole in the door several days before so he could peek in. And he came into the theater as the play was going on, and the guards all let him in because, as I said, he was a very famous actor in Washington, D.C. And he came into the box, which was unguarded, and he shot the president in the back of the head. There was another officer in the room who jumped up, but Wilkes also had a knife, and he stabbed this officer. And then he barred the door. Booth jumped to the stage, which was about 12 feet, and he stabbed the music orchestra conductor as he escaped through a side door to a waiting horse. Now, because he had a horse, he was wearing spurs, and his spurs caught in the bunting surrounding the president's seat. And so when he landed very poorly on his leg, and he broke one of the bones in his leg. So he was crippled immediately. People do not agree on what he said. Some people said he said one thing and others said another, so I'm not going to report anything because eyewitnesses simply do not agree on what that man said as he leapt to the stage. Lincoln's bodyguard, John Parker, was drinking in a saloon across the street while all this was happening. He was not the regular bodyguard. Lincoln's regular bodyguard was on another mission somewhere, and so he was a substitute. There was no Secret Service back then. They just had one or two guys that they hired as bodyguards for the president. And this guy was drinking in a saloon when John Wilkes Booth killed the president. Booth used this gun, a Philadelphia Derringer .41 caliber. It's very small. You could hide this in the palm of your hand, and that's one of the reasons he chose it. He also chose it because it's a very powerful gun. For such a tiny little thing, it's more powerful than a .38 or a 9mm or a .357. The bullet is bigger than any of the other guns, and its velocity is just as fast, but its energy exceeds that. So this makes it the most powerful gun. So it's actually a miracle that Lincoln didn't die instantly when this huge bullet came through the back of his head. The bullet entered his brain right behind his left ear, and it lodged in the front of his skull. The next day, April 15th, at 7:22 a.m., President Lincoln dies in the Peterson House across the street from the Ford Theater. They carried him over here, and there were numerous doctors that attended him throughout the night. And the The very first doctor that saw him lying on the floor in the Ford Theater, he knew immediately this wound was not survivable. It was a fatal wound. And all they could do was to open up the blood clots during the evening. But he died absolutely peacefully. And this is an actual photograph of the bed he was lying in when he passed away. About 2 weeks later, Union cavalry cornered John Wilkes Booth in a Virginia barn, and they ordered him to come out, and he refused. So they set the barn on fire, and he started to run out with a rifle, and this Union soldier, Boston Corbett, shot him, and ironically, he shot him in the head. He didn't die instantly. They drug him out of the barn and drug him up to the porch of this house, and he did live for a couple of hours. After he died, they took his body back to Washington, D.C. They needed to verify that this was, in fact, John Wilkes Booth. And they had 10 people come who knew him very, very well because, as I said, he was a well-known actor. And they all identified his body. In fact, he had a tattoo on his wrist with his initials. So there is no doubt that John Wilkes Booth was killed. Now, as I said, when John Wilkes Booth leaped out of the president's box onto the stage 12 feet below, he fractured a bone in his leg. He broke his leg. So the men that were helping Booth escape took him to this doctor, Dr. Samuel Mudd, who lived in northern Maryland. And Dr. Mudd set the bone in his leg. And then John Wilkes Booth and the men left. Well, Dr. Mudd was later arrested as part of the conspiracy. They arrested 9 men and women as members of this gang that had planned the assassination of President Lincoln. They had a trial. It was a 9-member military panel, and when it came time to vote on the death penalty for Dr. Mudd, he survived by 1 vote. The vote was 5-4, and instead of getting hanged along with the others, he was sentenced to life in prison. And he was sentenced to this place. This is, at the time it was called Fort Jefferson. Today it's called the Dry Tortugas. This is this God-forsaken prison 70 miles out in the ocean due west of Key West, Florida. Literally out in the middle of nowhere. This is where Dr. Mudd was confined for the rest of his life. Now, what happened was, within a year after he was sent to prison here, yellow fever broke out in the prison. And dozens of prisoners started dying of yellow fever. And the doctor, the military doctor in charge of the prison, he died. So Dr. Mudd said, look, I'll be the doctor for all of the prisoners. And he started taking care of all of the yellow fever. And eventually he cured this epidemic. He saved all of these dozens and dozens of prisoners and soldiers who were stationed out here at Fort Jefferson. Because of his heroic action in saving the prisoners and soldiers, President Andrew Johnson commuted his sentence and set him free. And he went back to Maryland and resumed his practice as a doctor. Now, Lincoln's body was carried by train to Springfield, Illinois, because that's where Lincoln came from. He was in the Congress in the state of Illinois. And this is an actual photograph of the funeral train that carried his body. millions of Americans lined the railroad tracks between Washington, D.C. and Springfield, Illinois, to pay honor to the slain president. This is the actual tomb of Abraham Lincoln. It took him about 30 or 40 years to actually get this thing built, but this is where he is buried in a beautiful little park in Springfield, Illinois. I've been there probably a half a dozen times because I grew up just 40 miles from Springfield. There is a famous bust of Lincoln in front of it. And when you walk up to it, because this is made out of brass, his nose is shiny. And that's because millions upon millions of people have come and they have rubbed the nose of Lincoln for good luck. On April 27th, the steamboat Sultana, carrying 2,300 passengers, explodes and sinks in the Mississippi River. And here's the worst part. It killed 1,800 mostly Union survivors of the infamous Andersonville prison. This was the worst prison in the Confederacy, and I'll tell you more about it. But can you imagine? 1,800 of these Union soldiers who survived that prison died when this riverboat exploded. What a tragedy. On May 4th, Lieutenant General Richard Taylor, who was commanding all Confederate forces in Alabama, Mississippi, and eastern Louisiana, he surrenders his forces to Union General Edward Canby at Citronelle, Alabama. And this effectively ended all Confederate resistance east of the Mississippi River. So this is the second major surrender. This is interesting. On May 5th, in North Bend, Ohio, which is a suburb of Cincinnati, we have the very first train robbery in the country takes place. On May 5th, President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, meets with his Confederate cabinet for the last time in Georgia, and the Confederate government is officially dissolved. A few days later, on May 10th, Confederate President Jefferson Davis is captured by the Union Army near Irwinville, Georgia. Now, this was a popular picture. According to rumor, President Jefferson Davis masqueraded as a woman to disguise himself as he tried to escape the Union Army. Unfortunately, that's not true. What he did is, as the soldiers were approaching, he did put on his wife's big overcoat and tried to escape through the swamps out the back. But the Union soldiers caught up with him. So he wasn't dressed as a woman. He was simply wearing his wife's big coat. On May 12th through the 13th, there was the Battle of Palmetto Ranch. This is in far South Texas, more than a month after General Lee surrenders. And this is the last battle of the Civil War with casualties. And ironically, it ended with a Confederate victory. This Union soldier, John J. Williams, is officially listed as the last man killed in the Civil War. He was a young father of two. He was a blacksmith in Portland, Indiana, which is north central Indiana. Now, Palmetto Ranch is 13 miles east of Brownsville, Texas, on the Rio Grande River. So here's Brownsville, And this is the Rio Grande. This is the border between Texas and Mexico. And this battle occurred right here at Palmetto Ranch. This is kind of interesting to me because you see, this is where I was born. I was born just 12 miles away in Harlingen, Texas, back in 1944. On May 23rd, the Grand Review of the Armies. The Union Army troops parade down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. to celebrate the end of the American Civil War. On May 29th, President Andrew Johnson issues a proclamation of general amnesty for most citizens of the former Confederacy. In other words, you are forgiven for being traitors. On June 2nd, Confederate forces west of the Mississippi River under General Edmund Kirby Smith surrender at Galveston, Texas, and they become the last to do so. On June 19th, Union Major General Gordon Granger lands at Galveston, Texas, and he informs the people of Texas of the Emancipation Proclamation. That event is today celebrated as Juneteenth. On June 23rd, at Fort Townsend in Oklahoma Territory, Confederate General Stan Waite, a Cherokee Indian, surrenders the last significant rebel army. This is finally it. All Confederate forces have now surrendered throughout the entire United States. On a lighter note, on the 4th of July, Lewis Carroll publishes his children's novel, Alice's Adventure in Wonderland. And this is a photograph of the original cover of the book. On July 5th, the United States Secret Service is founded. As I said, up until this time, there was no one officially protecting the president or the vice president. They just hired private guards. So after the assassination of President Lincoln, the government decided they should formally begin to protect our presidents and vice presidents and senior administrators. So that's when the U.S. Secret Service was founded, July 5th. On July 7th, following Abraham Lincoln's assassination on April 14th, the 4 conspirators condemned to death during the trial are hanged, and they include David Harold, George Atzrod, Mary Surratt, and Lewis Powell. And this is an actual photograph of the 4 bodies hanging. On July 10th, the Christian Mission is formed, and it was later renamed the Salvation Army. On July 25th, in the market square of Springfield, Missouri, Wild Bill Hickok shoots David Tutt dead over a poker debt in what is regarded as the first true Western fast draw shoot down. And you're looking at Wild Bill Hickok. On September 26th, a man by the name of Champ Ferguson becomes the first person and one of only two to be convicted of war crimes for actions taken during the American Civil War. He was found guilty by a U.S. Army tribunal of the murder of 53 people, and he was hanged on October 20th. This is a picture of he and the men that he led that committed these atrocities. They were basically a guerrilla outfit for the Confederates. On October 11th, Murat Bay Rebellion. Paul Bogle leads hundreds of black men and women in a march in Jamaica. The rebellion is brutally suppressed by the British government, and Governor Edward John Eyre executed 400 of the rioters. On October 26th, the Standard Oil Company opens. Way back then. On November 6th, the CSS, that's the Confederate steamship, Shenandoah. This is the last remnant of the Confederate States of America and its military. This ship surrendered in Liverpool, England, after fleeing westward from the Pacific. On December 18th, Secretary of State William Seward declares the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution has been ratified by 3/4 of the states, including those in secession. Slavery is legally outlawed in the last 2 states of Kentucky and Delaware, and the remaining 45,000 slaves are freed. Merry Christmas. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, Jonathan Shank and Barry Ownby formed the Ku Klux Klan in the American South, and their purpose was to resist Reconstruction and to intimidate carpetbaggers and to repress the freed slaves. On November 10th, Captain Henry Wirz, who was the Confederate superintendent of the infamous Andersonville prison, is hanged, becoming the second of 2 combatants to be executed for war crimes committed during the American Civil War. Andersonville prison was the most notorious prison probably ever conceived. At its peak, it had 45,000 prisoners, and they were just living on the ground out in the open. And they had practically no water, very, very little food. Disease was rampant, and 13,000, almost a third of all of the prisoners died because of the cruel and inhuman conditions under which they were kept. This camp was built for 10,000 prisoners, and they put 45,000 prisoners in it. Anyway, this man was convicted of war crimes and hanged. This is an actual photograph of his hanging. Of course, there were no radios and certainly no televisions back then, but there was still music. People played instruments and sang songs. So what were the most popular songs of 1865? Tenting on the Old Campground. I first learned this song when I was a young boy in the 4th grade. And I still remember the first line. We're tenting tonight on the old campground. Give us a song to cheer. Ora Lee. Beautiful dreamer. Shall we gather at the river? There were far fewer Americans in 1865 than there are today. Let me show you just how dramatically America has changed. Today, there are 350 million of us Americans, and each one of these little figures stands for 1 million Americans. So there's 350 million of us today. How many people were in America in 1865? 31 million. Only 8% of today's population. So America was basically empty. Think about it. Take 100 people and line them up, and then get rid of 92 of them, and that's all you would have left in America back in 1865. 1865 was the beginning of mass immigrations into the United States. Over the next 40 years, 27.3 million new immigrants would come to the United States, nearly doubling the population of the country from just 31 million. In 1865, for the first time in America, more Americans lived in cities and towns than in the country. Let me tell you about those towns. So, how have our cities grown from the end of the Civil War till now? It's been pretty dramatic. New York City had 750,000 people in 1865. Now they have 8.8 million. Boston had 177,000 people. Now they have 675,000 people. Philadelphia had 560,000. They're 3 times that size now with 1,603,000. So Philadelphia was a good-sized city back in the Civil War. This is surprising. Chicago only had 112,000 people during the Civil War. Now they have 2,746,000. Atlanta. I always thought of Atlanta, as this big, important city in the South. Atlanta only had 22,000 people during the Civil War. And today it's got close to 500,000 people. So it's not nearly as big as I always envisioned it. I always heard of the burning of Atlanta. Well, it wasn't like the burning of Boston or the burning of New York, was it? This surprised me. I lived in St. Louis for 30 some odd years. St. Louis had 160,000 people. So St. Louis was bigger than Chicago and way bigger than Atlanta and almost as big as Boston during the Civil War. And today it's got 300,000 people. So it hasn't grown nearly as much as Chicago or New York. Richmond. Richmond was a pretty good-sized city for a southern city, 100,000 people. It's doubled in size to 226,000 today. Dallas. Dallas was a little village. There was barely 678 people in the city or the village of Dallas. And today, of course, it's 1,304,000. How about Miami? Oh, I'm sorry, New Orleans. New Orleans was big. So New Orleans was bigger than Chicago and almost as big as Boston. bigger than St. New Orleans was a big, important city during the Civil War, and it's basically doubled in size. And now, Miami, 200 people, it was barely there. And today it's about close to 450,000 people. So that's how our cities have grown in America since the end of the Civil War. You see, life expectancy in 1865 was just 39 years. Think about it. You're 39 years old, most of us died. Today in America, our life expectancy is 77 years. So we've almost doubled our life expectancy since the end of the Civil War. The average worker in 1865 made $473 a year. Now, let me convert that into today's dollars. That's still only $7,790 in today's dollars. So life was rough. Life was tough back then, my friends. You had to really, really work hard, and you didn't make very much money. So what was introduced way back in 1865? Well, there was this thing called the Springle pump. It's a vacuum pump that uses drops of mercury falling through a small tube to trap air, and what it does is it creates a vacuum in things. We didn't have any way of creating a vacuum. Now, I'd never heard of this thing until I put this report together. And the only reason I mentioned it is because there was another guy who discovered this pump, and he went and bought one, and he did something pretty interesting with it. You see, Thomas Edison used this pump 14 years later to create the first light bulb. He needed to get rid of all of the air inside the bulb, and this thing is how he did it. There's a company called John Deere, and they received a United States patent for a plow. So here we have the first patented plow. And of course, this thing was pulled by horses. There were no tractors way back then. Those would come along decades later. The web offset printing machine. Now, what made this revolutionary is before now, all of the paper was single sheets. So you had to feed the paper in one by one into the printing press. This had continuous rolls of paper. So the paper just rolled through this machine continuously. This is exactly how modern printing presses in our newspapers and magazines work. But this was the first. It was invented way back in 1865. The very first antiseptic surgery took place. British surgeon John Lister performs the first antiseptic surgery using carbonic spray on his instruments and bandages. Until that time, doctors did not sterilize anything. This guy, Roper, invented a steam carriage, so one could argue this is the first car. Now, it was steam-driven, but that's what it looked like. He later invented a steam-driven motorcycle, and he fell off of his motorcycle and killed himself. Oh, the first steamroller was invented in 1865. And as I say, about 2 decades later, we would finally see the first steam-driven tractors, but not yet. So I want to thank you for watching. I hope I've helped you better understand the history of our country. Be well.